This is the Daily Growth Discipleship Podcast. I'm Chris Lambert.
And I'm Josh Havens.
We're on a journey to learn what it means to live a lifestyle of discipleship. We're glad you're joining us today and hope that as you set aside this time for God, that He will help you grow today in the everyday moments of life.
There's a reason the gym is really full on January 3rd, but really empty by the end of the month. And that's because habits are something that are really hard to develop, and it takes a lot of dedication to actually make them stick. Well, to talk about these habits again, we're talking to Justin Earley.
Justin Earley holds a Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University and is the creator of The Common Rule, a program of habits designed to form us in the love of God and neighbor. He is also a mergers and acquisitions lawyer in Richmond, Virginia. He previously spent several years in China as the founder and general editor of The Urbanity Project and as the director of Thought and Culture Shapers, a nonprofit organization dedicated to serving the community through arts. He and his wife, Lauren, have 4 sons and live in Richmond, Virginia.
One of the things I've struggled with the most in my own spiritual growth is finding the right habits for me. It's one thing to just say, yeah, I need to read my Bible every morning or I need to pray every morning, but those habits for me tend to be really difficult to make stick for a long time. And in this chapter, Justin talks about some of the ways that he's found to make habits not only stick, but make them very valuable for spiritual growth throughout your entire life. And the habits and techniques that Justin talks about form the basis of his book, The Common Rule.
I'm curious, how did you come up with those initial habits? Was that something your wife and your friends said, look, you need to do these, or did you come up with them?
They were the product of a lot of trial and error, and also a lot of reading other people. Sabbath, for instance, that nothing new about that one. just a quick look at the Old Testament all the way to the New would suggest that that's what we were made for. I knew that it annoyed me how much the phone was dominating my life as a lawyer, how much I was always on call. I sensed in my immediate community that there was a sort of universal problem of we get all tired and then we just flip a screen on. For my parents, it was television. For my friends and family, it was Netflix. And then I, also sort of noticed at the office that I and most of the people were working through every meal. So I guess I don't know if I have a good answer about how each one came about, but I guess one way to put it is when I started to get really interested in the power of habits in spiritual formation, I started to informally, I wouldn't have had words for it then, to ask, what are the idols of the culture that I live in? And how are they manifest in small habits? Okay, and then those are the ones I want to tweak. So I saw this idol of omnipresence in the way we use our phone. We think we can always be somewhere else, and that really means we're no place. So I thought, okay, that's an idol of omnipresence. How do we just be present? I was like, well, okay, what if we turn off our phones an hour a day and practice that? Or I saw this idol of taking in all the world's information and all the world's stories and trying to keep up with everything, whether it was a news or the next, Game of Thrones series. Just there was this uncurated fire hose of media, which to me seemed like an idol of omniscience or always being involved or always being on. And I thought, okay, how can we curate this for good purposes? And that led to the weekly habit. So they were all kind of like tweaks on what I think the idols of our culture is and how we can turn them into habits that form us in who we should be, not in idolatry, because that's what's at stake. Worship is what is at stake in our habits, and that's why I think you can call habits liturgies in a metaphor that works. It's not entirely the same, but it's quite helpful.
Yeah, liturgy is in lowercase l.
We
like
right.
to say.
Right. It's not ending in the communion of the church, but they are little liturgies in that they are repeated acts of worship which form us. The difference between liturgy and habit is liturgy admits that it's worship. Habits often obscure what we're worshiping, but of course that doesn't mean we're not worshiping. The question is, what are we worshiping?
It feels like when people try to start a new habit, Like for the first couple of weeks, it's fairly easy, and then it really starts to get hard because then you're trying to kind of rewire your brain. What was that process like for you as you tried to really carry these new habits from something that you were passionate about in the first 2 weeks to something that you continued doing after the passion maybe started to die out?
Yes. I'm so glad, because that's a really nitty-gritty practical question that's important. Yeah, any new habit, as we know, there's kind of a phase where you're really excited and you're just doing it because you're like desperate for life change. Maybe it's January 5th and you're still eating healthily. And then you get into the phase where you're like, this is hard, or you just start forgetting because the excitement's worn off. And that's where, new ideas cease to become habits because the unconscious takes back over and the unconscious hasn't internalized the habit. So, we're in trouble. So here's what I did. And, this is really nitty-gritty specific. After I sat down with my friends that day, I said, here are the daily and weekly habits I want to keep. And I actually just made a little checklist on my phone. Again, I'm very actually pro technology, despite some of my critiques of technology. The phone can be great if you use it correctly and turn it off sometimes. So I had a checklist on my phone, and I would actually send my two friends, Matt and Steve, who were keeping me accountable to this, screenshots at the end of the week of just, did I check off the ones that I was supposed to check off? So I think what this demonstrates, and this is important, is that you need two things. You need specificity, with a habit and keeping some way of keeping track of it. And you need accountability and community, which is why I think the Common Rule, at first, I think maybe is a little bit of an odd book because it's very specific about the habits. There's 4 daily and 4 weeklies. And it's very specific that this is meant to be in community. You're meant to do it with other people. But those are what make all the difference. That's how you get through the phase. So after a month or two of just sending my friends a checklist every week, did I do them? And by the way, I failed all the time. There were so many times where I was like, didn't hit this one, didn't hit that one. But what happened is after a couple weeks, I started to notice that I was checking things off, and I didn't need to think about them through the week. I started to, get in a groove of reading scripture before phone, and I ceased to have to think about it. And this is the magic point of habit formation. This is why it's so good and so bad, because you get to a point where you get in the routine, and then it became normal for me, for example, to, instead of reach for my phone on my nightside table, to just leave it there, and I would walk downstairs to the couch and open my Bible. And when I started to realize I wasn't thinking about it anymore, that's when I started to realize that a habit had shifted. And that's when I think you get to a good place of a new default. Now, of course, there's exceptions to your new default. That's not the point. The point is the rule. And to notice that as a rule, I was living in my work email every morning. I had never even thought about it. But now that the habit had shifted, I was living in scripture in the morning, and I didn't need to think about getting there. Of course, I thought about reading it when I was doing it and I was meditating on it. But that hump is a huge speed bump in the morning of just getting to the word. And that's what habit can do for you. It can level that out and make it a routine.
Yeah, and what I love about habits the most, like when I read, you talk about Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit, and when I read his book, I felt like I had stumbled upon the secret, because it's really what you're pointing out. It's a way to fight back against the world's pressures to form you.
Yes.
Because you're right.
Yes.
We come up against those pressures every single day. I mean, drive down the road in the middle of rush hour traffic and see if the world doesn't try to exert its formational pressures on you, right? I mean, I struggle with that spiritually. I think more than any other habit is just trying to look at the people around me as actual human beings and not just, people that deserve to be yelled at. But
that's right.
I digress. And so,
no, it's so important. Keep going.
Yeah. So, I think it's time that we just jump into the actual habits, and let's break these things out a little bit. So you've got them broke down. Well, first off, let's talk about your habit spectrum, because you have a habit spectrum that you have that sort of forms its own matrix of loving God and loving neighbor, and then embrace and resist. Talk to us about what those 4 areas mean, and then we'll start digging into the 4 dailies and the 4 weeklies that you have.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, there's great literature on habits now. You mentioned Charles Duhigg, wonderful book. Atomic Habits just came out by James Clear. There's a wonderful, there's just a new frontiers of neuroscience that a lot of people are realizing how important habits are. Much of that discussion is about how to organize your business better, how to manage your employees better, how to be a better employee, how to be more productive, etc. Great stuff, especially if you're in the business world. Not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is how can we use the natural sort of, this is how our brains and lives work. How can we use that to obey the great commandment of love God and love neighbor? So that's why there's this habit spectrum of saying these 4 habits are trying to get us into grooves and rhythms of looking up and loving God and worshiping him. And the other 4 habits are pushing us towards how do we look up to our neighbors? How do we be present with the people we're with, and how do we love them? And then the embrace and resist, those are the other poles of the diagram, if you will. And that just tries to acknowledge that, creation and fall, I guess is the best way to put it. There are good things in the world. We're meant, some of these habits are habits of embracing community, embracing rest. But then there's evil. There is evil and there's temptation. There's active evil and temptation that is going to interrupt, cause tragedy, form our lives, and we're trying to resist those kind of things. That's why fasting is as a habit. That's why turning off your phone is a habit. There's certain, habits of resistance and embrace. So that's how, if anybody's listening, pull it up at www.thecommonrule.org, and you can see the diagram of the habits. Or if you open the book, you'll see the diagram of the habits, and that'll make a lot more sense when it's in front of you.
Yeah, and that's what I love about. I mean, the OCD person in me loves the way that this breakdown, because it's so nice and neat that you have they all fit in this category, and it's the same 8, even for the 4 daily and the 4 weekly, and they address each one so well. What do you want people to avoid when they start practicing the common rule? Why are they going to fail, and what would you want them to know to avoid it?
Oh yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. I want people to avoid feeling like this is something they have to do well. What I want them to know is that, as I shared, the way I came about this is through failure. And the way that I came to be somebody who actually does live according to these habits still now today is by failing at them a lot, often, and still now. What you are not expected to do, or what you should not try to do, is say, I am going to do all of these and that will solve all my problems. What you should expect is that by trying them and experimenting with them and failing with them in community, 2 things will happen. You will start to notice the unseen patterns that you didn't see before, and that's really valuable. We call that confession in some senses, starting to realize, oh, I didn't realize that was in my heart or life or habit. And then there's restoration of realizing, if you do this in community, you're talking about it and you're realizing, I don't like that. How can I fix that? And maybe the way to fix that, for example, is continuing scripture before phone, or maybe it's some other habit. But what I think the common rule does for you is it gets you to just open your eyes to the world of formation, and then offers you, I hope gently, a pathway that if you want to try living differently, try a couple weeks of these habits and see what you learn. But remember that failure is where we live as broken people. And that's great, because failure is the door to grace. Every time we fail, we have the option. It is open to us to see that Christ comes to us in the midst of our failure, restores us, loves us, and then we can get back up. And that's actually the beautiful life. The beautiful life is not the perfect one, the well-organized one. The beautiful life is the broken one, where we see that the Lord was broken for us, so we can now be broken and still loved anyway.
One of the things that Justin talks about in his book is Keystone Habits, and it's something that the research has fleshed out, that a keystone habit is the singular habit that makes the other habits either easier or more possible to stick with. And for me, that habit has been one of journaling. Now, not just your traditional journal where you're staring at the blank page. That has its own problems for me. And that's why I created the Daily Growth Journal, a simple guided journal for you to use every day that only takes 5 to 10 minutes. And that has been very helpful for me to keep myself accountable and on track with daily Bible reading and prayer. And I think that if you're really wanting to get started with some of these habits that Justin is talking about, journaling might be a great place to start. Tomorrow's chapter, we're going to talk about the daily habits in particular, and then the next day, we're talking about the weekly habits. And we want you guys just to be able to implement those, as he says, because they're great habits and we believe that they will change your life. But if you're looking for a little extra push or a little extra accountability in it, definitely be working with somebody. You need to be doing this in community. But a journal can also help you wrestle with it privately and hold yourself accountable for growth that will last.
Thanks for listening to the Daily Growth Discipleship Podcast. If you want to stay up to date with everything that's happening at Daily Growth, go to dailygrowthdiscipleship.com and subscribe for free. Or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.